Leda and the Swan. A sudden blow, the great wings beating still above the staggering girl, her thighs caressed by the dark webs, her nape caught in his bill, he holds her helpless breast upon breast. How can those terrified vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? And how can body, laid in that white rush, but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? A shudder in the loins engenders there the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead. Being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood of the air, did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop? Yeats' Leda and the Swan is an interesting poem for a range of different reasons. I've identified 4 levels of engagement with the subject matter of the poem, which is cleverly communicated in the context of a sonnet, which we normally associate with love. However, in this case, a violent act of physical love, a rape. The rape actually distorts the usual prosaic elements of the sonnet form, which makes it congruent with the violence of the act of overwhelming and overpowering physical love. The sonnet form is familiar to us because we studied Hopkins in Year 11. As you know, many of Hopkins's poems are sonnets, utilising an octet and a sestet with a distinctive rhyme scheme. These poems are usually associated with passion, with love. As mentioned, Yeats's Leda and the Swan is about passion as well, but it is camouflaged in the brutal rape of a woman by a swan, which is usually associated with beauty. Not a lion or a monster, but a swan. The poem explores this sexual act, a rape, which can be viewed ambiguously on a range of different levels. The relationship between a male and a female, yes, but the ambiguity is more in the acceptance and the reaction to the act that needs to be explored. Firstly, the poem is based on an ancient Greek myth, Leda and the Swan, where Zeus, in the guise of a majestic swan, rapes Leda, the mother of Helen of Troy. Zeus is the king of gods. The second idea is that the poem explores the antinomy of nature and culture being abused by forces beyond our control, and the implications of this abuse. Think about nature and culture and how industry and capitalism has asserted itself vigorously to compromise the beauty and intrinsic value of the natural world. The third idea focuses on Irish nationalism asserting itself through a forceful, powerful act, possibly the Troubles during the early 1900s. The Irish are represented by the beautiful Leda, and Zeus is the all-powerful god figure, ironically manifested in the form of a huge swan representing England. The fourth idea could be the masculine-feminine divide, with man asserting himself upon a vulnerable and innocent female. On a personal level, the swan could be Yeats as Zeus and Maud Gonne being Leda, with the act having significant repercussions for both figures. Structurally, the poem Leda and the Swan is a different type of sonnet. Yes, it has the traditional 14 lines with the distinctive rhyme scheme, but the stanzas are divided into 3 parts, 2 quatrains and a sestet, and line 11 appears to be broken off into 2 lines. Structurally, the poem Leda and the Swan is a different type of sonnet. Yes, it has the traditional 14 lines with the distinctive rhyme scheme, but the stanzas are divided into 3, 2 quatrains and a sestet, and line 11 appears to be broken off into 2 lines. Although admittedly the first 2 quatrains can be grouped into an octet of 8 lines, finishing with a sestet of 6 lines. Scholars presume that Yeats divided line 11 in order to heighten the impact of Agamemnon being dead and to show how the poem shifts back to Leda's perspective after leaping forward in time. The poet's metre, or rhythmical beat, is a rugged iambic pentameter. In this metre, the most common in English as seen in Shakespeare, and also reflects our conversational rhythm. Each line has 10 beats, with an unstressed beat followed by a stressed one. He holds her helpless breast upon his breast. But only a few lines in the poem conform to this rhythm. For example, the last line has 11 beats. Yeats didn't want to be boxed in by one particular rhythm. If he thought something else sounded better, as an exercise, you might try counting the beats and stresses in the rhythmically tight first stanza. Yeats also plays somewhat loose with the rhyme scheme. The general pattern is A-B, A-B, C-D, C-D, E-F, G, E-F, G. But some of the rhymes are only slant rhymes like push and rush, or up and drop. The reason there is irregularity in the iambic pentameter is the subject matter. A rape which is rough and violent and confronting. No poetry is evident in a rape, despite the sexual union which seems to be forcefully inflicted upon the vulnerable woman. The myth says that the most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, one of the daughters of Tyndareus, the king of Sparta. Her mother was Leda, who had been either raped or seduced by Zeus in the form of Swan. In the Greek myth which inspired Yeats's poem, Leda is seduced by Zeus, who takes her in the guise of a swan. Their union produces 3 eggs. One doesn't hatch, which could be representing the metaphorical destruction or a potent force yet to come. This is alluded to in Yeats's poem The Second Coming. One egg, as a result of the union, produces 2 children, 2 demigod children, Helen and Pollux. These are assumed to be the children of Zeus. And the last egg produces 2 mortal children, assumed to be the children of Leda's mortal husband, King Tyndareus, Castor and Clytemnestra. It is important to note that the overwhelming result from the rape of Leda is destruction and death. The women or female bodies that are connected through Leda, Helen, Clytemnestra, all 3 women, are all ultimately provoked or inspire death, warfare or murder through their actions and choice. If you run with this area of analysis into the Yeats's poem, you can make strong links to Among School Children, An Irish Airman Foresees His Death, and Second Coming, among others. Analysing the poem, you can see in the first 4 lines, the swan delivers a sudden blow to Leda's head as he hovers in the air above her. He looms over her, his webbed feet pinning her thighs as he captures her neck in his bill. He holds her helpless, quivering body to his. As we go into the second quatrain, how can Leda's terrified, confused fingers push the swan's manhood away from her spreading thighs? How, in all of this horror, could Leda help but feel and focus on the strange beating heart of this swan? The swan's orgasm begets the Trojan War, which results in the death of Agamemnon. This is the Volta. A shudder in the loins engenders there the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead. The broken wall could be the hymen, the burning roof, the vagina, and the tower, the penis. So enraptured and overpowered by her assailant, did Leda know that this swan was a god? Did Zeus, before coldly releasing Leda, know that the future daughter would start the Trojan War? This is explored in the sestet. Being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood of the air, did Leda put this knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop, dismiss her after the physical union? Note the caesura that precedes blow in line 1 emphasises the impact and surprise felt by Leda that is reiterated by the use of sudden. Yeats creates ambiguity as to whether Leda consents. Her eyes are caressed, which reflects a more affectionate scene, and her thighs might be loosening through choice and not by force. Yet Yeats also describes her breast as helpless, which implies she has no choice over what happens. Whether or not she is rendered helpless by her lust remains one of the key points for debate. A shudder in the loins engenders there the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead. This quotation makes clear that the effects of this rape ends with not only the death of Agamemnon, but also the absolute destruction of Troy. It reiterates the point that the outcome of a potential rape is not merely one woman's subjugation, but also the catastrophic end of an era. If Leda did indeed consent to the union with Zeus, then she is effectively the catalyst for the horror of this destruction. This may be a reflection on the actions of some of the women Yeats knew, such as Maud Gonne, or Yeats may even be discussing the consequences of his own actions. Yeats often ponders if small impulsive decisions can later be seen to herald horrendous consequences. The conception of the seed for destruction of a civilization, in this case Troy. The consequences of one action are seen to unfold over decades of violence and destruction. This poem can also be seen to represent Yeats's frustration with the decline of Ireland. Perhaps the Irish were being metaphorically raped by the English, the destruction of culture and indeed a nation rendered as a motif here by the destruction of Troy. As is typical with the Petrarchan sonnets, after the Volta, Yeats reflects on the actions described in the first 8 lines of the poem and attempts to answer the questions he set up. However, he still does not come to a conclusion. He leaves the reader with the unanswerable question: did Leda put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop? Technical devices such as alliteration, he holds her brute blood, iambic pentameter and the irregular distribution of sentences and caesura all contribute towards making the effect of shock with respect to the subject matter. The irregular metre that this irregular distribution creates is that it echoes the gasping and throbbing pulsations of the rape by its irregularity, as the caesuras interrupt the flow of the sentences and the stresses pentameter do not always comply with the natural word stresses. The line, "How can those terrified vague fingers push," jars the rhythm of the pentameter when read aloud, and hence causes this effect. The abstract terms used to describe the unnamed swan, great wings, dark webs, white rush, and feathered glory, are in stark contrast to the concrete and tangible terms used to describe Leda, her loosening thighs, her nape, and her helpless breast, which seem representative, factual and literal, and also present only one reading. However, when the concrete and abstract diffuse into each other later on in the poem, when we see Leda described as having vague fingers and the swan with tangible body parts, wings, beak and bill, it is interesting to note that the ways in which the two characters are described reflect the ambiguity and the conflict that Yeats presents. The contrast in tenses used before and after the Volta alter the immediacy of particular events in the reader's mind. The present tense of holds, push, loosening, feel and lies before the Volta makes the events of the rape seem immediate and vivid, whereas the past tenses of caught, mastered and did make the rhetorical questions seem more pensive, distant and retrospective. The voices of the verbs used to describe Leda and the swan are juxtaposing. The swan engenders and holds actively, whereas Leda is caressed, caught and mastered. One could infer from this that Leda has no choice in her rape. Some of the cross-references from the poem definitely could be among school children, where we can quote, "I dream of a Ledian body." This represents Maud Gonne, but the reasons for which Yeats chooses to represent her by using the mythical Leda are set out in the historical context of the myth told in Leda and the Swan.